Here, hello Houston. We're here reminiscing about learning, which we were talking about last time. And I just wanted to review for you that I think last time we had reached the point where we were talking about trying to separate learning and performance. And my point here was, if you'll remember, as we were talking about it, this was 3 different groups of rats. One, which performed most poorly in a tea maze, was never given food regardless of which way they turned. And so the researchers just randomly said, this is an error, this is okay. And whichever way they went was recorded either as correct, in quotes, or an error. But there was no food recessed in the cups at either end of the maze. The second group always got food if they turned in the right direction, and their performance improved steadily through the course, or I should diagram it this way, I guess, improved steadily through the course of their performance on the maze. The third group is the interesting one. This is the one that got no food through 10 trials, and then on the 11th trial, for the first time, had food actually present. And in that case, what happens is that on that trial, their performance is like it was on the other 10. But on trial 12 and from there on, they actually performed better than the group that had had food all along. Bottom line, what is impacted there by adding food is performance, not learning. It's quite clear that the group, even when it was wandering around the maze randomly, had still been learning the relevant features of the maze, so that when suddenly it was important to know which aisle was slightly darker or had stripes or polka dots or whatever, because that was randomly switched along with the food, what happened was that as soon as the polka dots or whatever the cue to turn was became relevant to the food, instantly their performance was even better than the group that had had food all along. It's interesting to look at the fact that their performance actually was consistently better than the group that had had food all along, which leads to a kind of an interesting problem, and that is the group that has gotten less food actually runs faster and more accurately, which is a kind of a type of problem. Somebody ultimately suggested, but I think it's probably the correct answer, and that is that the rats that did not initially have food ran with knowledge that there were times when there was not food present. And so they were running with a little bit more frustration accumulated in the apparatus than the ones who had always gotten food, and therefore that frustration may have given them just a little extra incentive to run fast in the maze. In any case, let's look then now at the most relevant, the most widely applicable law probably in all of psychology, and that is what's called the law of effect. What the law of effect says, and we've got fancy words here for you, is that it's a satisfying outcome will strengthen and an annoying outcome will weaken a modifiable connection between a stimulus and a response. In essence, what that's saying is that you and I will do more often things that lead to positive effects. That is, if anything we do leads to a state that we are more likely to seek, the net result is that we end up being more likely to actually do that when we have the opportunity. That's the law of effect. It turns out in all of psychology, that is probably the most widely applicable law that we have actually found at any time in our relatively short but illustrious history. Here's another way to diagram the same basic effect. And that is that if you are getting positive reinforcement, if you're getting something that you would normally seek anyway, you do something, you get something you like, the net result is, as plotted here, that the number of responses you emit will go steadily upward. Obviously, there's a performance limit, but in theory, what's happening here is the law of effect is in operation. That is, the more often you do what leads to that positive effect, the more likely you are to get that positive effect, and the net result is it increases the likelihood that you'll do whatever response is required. That's the law of effect essentially operationalized for you. Now we're going to hit you for the first and only time in the course with 5 definitions in a row. First of all, I want to define for you what is called a positive reinforcer. I've used this word reinforcer a number of times, and now in essence what I'd like to do is to anchor it in a definition for you, essentially saying that it's those events which, keyword, increase the performance of a response by their keyword presentation following the response. Okay? So in essence, a positive reinforcer is any event which when it immediately follows a response, increases the likelihood that the next opportunity for that response will lead to the response being performed. Okay? So again, a positive reinforcer involves those events which increase the performance of a response by their presentation immediately following the response. Compare that definition with the definition for a negative reinforcer, which is essentially very similar in wording. It is those events which increase the performance of a response by their removal following the response. The key words again are increase and removal. The only difference between those two definitions for a positive and a negative reinforcer is the consequences of the act. In one case, it's a positive reinforcer if it leads to the presentation of that reward or reinforcement. In the other case, it's a negative reinforcer if it involves the removal or reduction or elimination of the reward or reinforcer itself. So the point is that whether we're talking about a positive reinforcer or a negative reinforcer, as long as the word reinforcer is being used, what we're talking about is an increase in performance. Okay? Learn that, because I can show you introductory psychology texts in which those concepts are jumbled, are not correctly presented. It's a very difficult concept for some psychologists to learn, particularly when we throw in the third wrinkle, which is punishment. When we talk about a punisher, what we're talking about basically is the reverse of the other two effects. We are administering a punisher if we give someone, if we present a negative reinforcer, or if we remove a positive reinforcer. In other words, and you could say that even more cleanly, if we reduce or eliminate a positive event defined by the organism, or if we apply or increase a negative event, that's going to lead to a decrease in behavior. In fact, it will suppress behavior, but it is what's called a punisher. Some psychologists make a distinction between a positive punisher and a negative punisher. I don't think that makes a distinction that's worth worrying about at the introductory level. There are technical differences, but for all practical purposes, we can simply differentiate a reinforcer from a punisher. Now let me go back over those three definitions and point out one similarity between a positive reinforcer and a negative reinforcer is that both of them lead to an increase in performance. Okay? The one does so by adding something that the organism normally would have sought anyway, and the other one does so by removing something that the organism was not wild about having to begin with. In both cases, if you add something the organism would seek or withdraw something it would not seek, you have created a reinforcing situation. A positive reinforcer in the first situation, a negative reinforcer in the second situation. The opposite of that is what we call a punisher. A punisher is where we give the organism something it really would not have sought on its own, or we take away from it something that it would like. Let me see if we can integrate all that in the following table. This will show you essentially the key elements of what we're talking about here. That is, we're talking about two different types of events that may occur. I've labeled it types of reinforcer, but maybe we should more accurately say two different types of events across the top. Positive events, things the organism would seek, and aversive or negative events, things the organism normally would stay away from or avoid. And then two different types of results there. In one case, an event is presented. In the other case, it's taken away. And that gives us then four possible combinations. If we have a positive event which is presented, that is a positive reinforcer. If we have a negative event which is taken away or reduced or withdrawn, we have a negative reinforcer. Both of those, the positive and the negative reinforcers, lead to an increase in performance. Okay? The other two are punishers. That is, if we add or give something to the organism that it normally would not have sought, in other words, it's an aversive event, that's a punisher. If we take something away or reduce it or withhold it when the organism would normally have sought it, that's also a punisher. Test time, you ready? Is this a negative reinforcer? Or is it a punisher? Very good. You're doing well today. That is a punishment. What if we cut a kid's allowance? Is that a negative reinforcer or a punisher? No, it is not. It is a punisher. In the instance of spanking a child, we have given the youngster something it wouldn't normally seek, unless it's into S&M stuff early. I can't account for that. But normally a youngster does not like to be hit or hurt. Okay? So they don't normally seek it. And if we give it to them anyway, if we spank them, that is a punisher. On the other hand, allowances, which they love, if we take it away, that's also punishing. Okay? As I said, there are many psychologists that don't understand the difference between a negative reinforcer and a punisher. But if you hear somebody at a Little League game saying, boy, I really laid a negative reinforcer on my kid's butt the other night, no. They punish the kid. but they did not negatively reinforce them. A reinforcer leads to an increase in behavior. A punisher leads to a decrease in behavior. And it's that distinction that is the reason that psychologists normally will opt for a reinforcer rather than a punisher. The problem is that a punisher simply tells the organism what not to do. Okay? A punisher suppresses behavior. It gives no information about what should be done. You hit a kid and all you're telling the kid is, don't do that. And so the net result is a punisher will suppress behavior. But have you ever heard the saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play? That is exactly a consequence of applying punishers. When the cat is away, who is a punisher to rats and mice, the rats and mice will play. In other words, what punishment does is suppress behavior. It does not alter it. It provides no substitute. It gives no information other than what not to do. Whether it's a positive or a negative reinforcer, it does give the organism information about what to do, either to seek the positive reinforcement or a way to avoid the negative reinforcer. It provides information. So all in all, a psychologist will opt in favor of reinforcement, not punishment. I have never spanked the 12-year-old that you met the other day. You don't have to. All you're doing when you spank a child or hitting them is suppressing behavior. That's not the way to educate somebody. What you do is to use a negative or a positive reinforcer, and you increase behavior in that way. You give the organism information about what you desire, what needs to be done. Now let's look at two other definitions. Question, yes?
Could you give me an example of a negative reinforcer?
I'll give you a very specific way to differentiate between a negative reinforcer and a punisher. You and I do not walk around the university campus rushing from electric plug to put our fingers in, okay? Or light sockets. We don't, unscrew the button. We don't do that for two reasons. It's punishing to stick your finger in, and it is negatively reinforcing to pull it out, okay? It's punishing to stick it in because you're gaining something that most of us would not voluntarily seek, that is the pain of electric shock. And it's a negative reinforcer when you pull your finger out, okay? Maybe that'll help. That will at least distinguish the right-hand side of the table that we showed you a couple of minutes ago. Okay, let's go back now and look at two other ways to define reinforcers. First of all, let's talk about what I'm going to call primary reinforcers. These are reinforcers that are very limited in number and they are inherited. We have only two primary reinforcers which are inheritance-based. One is food and the other is fluid or water. We don't have to be taught the value of food. We know to eat when we're born, and in fact we appreciate a good meal from that time till we drop dead, basically. Those are primary reinforcers. They are very limited, but they're automated. They're inherited. Learned reinforcers are a much broader group, much more diverse, and many in number, and they are entirely learned. Classic example of a secondary reinforcer is money. We learn about the value of money. I can remember when Vijay, whom you met the other day, was about 4 or 5. He was playing with some coins on a table one day, and I asked him, which is worth more, a nickel or a dime? And I pointed out to each of them out to him. And he said, oh, a nickel. Why? It's bigger. Yeah. And so in essence, he was still in the process of learning the value of money. Trust me, by age 12, he knows it cold. But in essence, we learn the value of money. Money is strictly a secondary reinforcer. You can't sleep with money. Well, you could, but it'd be kind of kinky. You can't eat money. You can't drink money. You can't have sex with money. Well, let's don't get into that. It is a secondary reinforcer, but it is constantly, in our thankfully stable economy, always being reinforced for us. Put money in a Coke machine, get a Coke. Put money in a candy machine, get candy. Pay money, have a motel room. You name it. Money leads to the things that we like or is directly associated with it. So it's conditioned over and over and over again as a secondary reinforcer. And pretty soon, those positive things that we get with money become attributable to money itself. But it is a secondary reinforcer. Praise is a secondary reinforcer. A good grade, a smile. All of those are examples of secondary reinforcers. We seek them. We know their value. But in fact, they're learned. They're secondary reinforcers. Now, let's also look at how reinforcement actually works. There are at least 3 theories that have been proposed down through the years as to what's going on in reinforcement. One, the oldest, is the idea that reinforcement results from what is called drive reduction. Anytime you get hungry or thirsty, you are considered to be in a driven condition. There is a drive within you, an urge to get to the solution, that is, whether it's food or water, depending. Drive reduction theory argues that anything that produces food for you when you're hungry reduces the hunger drive and is thereby reinforcing for you. The problem with that explanation is that we don't have any way using drive to explain things like children playing. You leave children alone and they will play. They will invent games if there are not toys present. They will make games, but they will play all the time. And yet, if a child works a lot, is in a situation where they have to work a lot or they're not able to play, it isn't that there's a deprivation that builds up. They don't have to play extra long the next day to make up for the play they missed the previous day. So play doesn't fit any of the rules of drive, and yet it's quite clear that children love to play. They will play, all other things being equal. But there's no evidence that you get that there's a deprivation state that builds up if you don't get to play. So the bottom line is that, and I'm going to show you a variety of other reasons a little later in the motivation and motion section, but in essence, drive reduction as a theory has gone by the by. We no longer use it to explain how reinforcement actually works. Another theory that evolved out of the work of James Olds from the 1960s was represented by the fact that he was the first to implant, and it turned out by accident, an electrode in the hypothalamus of the rat. And he found an area in the hypothalamus where if you then connected that electrode to a mild source of electrical stimulation, that rat would press on a button until it literally dropped dead from exhaustion just to get occasional jolts of electricity in what is now called the reward center in the brain, in the hypothalamus. The rat would do that in preference to food, in preference to sex, in preference to sleeping, in preference to food, in preference to anything. It would literally bar press until it dropped from exhaustion. It would press on that bar to get that occasional shot of electricity. We now know that that same area of the brain releases into your bloodstream what are called endorphins anytime you feel good. You put it the other way around. When those are released, you in fact feel good. If you've got a favorite song that you haven't heard performed for a while, and all of a sudden you not only hear it performed, but performed well, you may experience goosebumps. You feel good. And in essence, that's because of the activity of that area in the hypothalamus. So here's an example that is exactly counter to drive reduction. That is, what I've just cited for you is a situation where electrical activity in the brain increases, and yet we interpret it as reinforcing. It's good. We enjoy that state. We work to get ourselves into that state. So onset of stimulation would argue that essentially anything that leads to an increase in the activity of that area of the brain is reinforcing. There's a third one, which is purely psychological. There isn't even a physiological mechanism involved here. It's what's called the activity rate principle, or also referred to as the Premack principle, in honor of David Premack, who originally proposed this about 10 or 15 years ago, even 20 years ago. In essence, what he argues is the following. What really determines what is reinforcing for you and me is what we would do if we had a choice among any of a wide variety of possible activities. For instance, let's suppose that we catch an undergraduate in the dorm Saturday morning at 8 a.m. when he wakes up, and miraculously, this is an idealistic science state we're setting up here, he has nothing driving him at the moment. There is absolutely nothing that he absolutely has to do. He has no urge to do this, that, or the other thing. The question then is, what will he actually do? In other words, what activities will he engage in, and how would we rank order from most to least likely to occur? So we watch him, and we simply count hours. Well, it turns out there are a number of different possibilities. He likes to play the piano. Maybe he'll practice piano. He also likes to play tennis. Maybe he'll play tennis. He likes to eat. He likes to engage in sex. Those last two, by the way, are separate activities. It turns out for this dude, from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., nothing but sex. He engages in sex for 14 hours after awaking that magical Saturday morning. Okay? 10 to 11, he eats. 11 to 11:30 that night, he practices the piano. And from 11:30 to 11:45, he plays tennis. Some of you are still sitting there thinking, 14 hours? Well, in essence, therein lies enough principles to describe for you, enough data to describe for you the activity rate principle. Two things that I think are important about this. First of all, as you can obviously appreciate, your reinforcement hierarchy, your hierarchy of activities may not overlap with any of those. You may prefer to listen to music, or go shopping, or sleep in. I mean, you name it. There are a lot of different activities, and I think you can also appreciate, we could, for any one person, we could make this list maybe 300 items long. I mean, there are a lot of different things we like to do under different circumstances. But the driving question is, what are you most likely to do when there's no pressure on you to go any particular direction? So if this is the kind of hierarchy that we get, the first point is that your hierarchy may be completely different from mine or from our examples, okay? So the hierarchy is essentially unique for each of us. That's point one. Point two, which also makes this appealing, is that the Premack principle is essentially that anything higher on a hierarchy can be used to reinforce any activity that is lower on the hierarchy. And it doesn't matter whose hierarchy we're dealing with. For this particular example, obviously, sex for this person was the number one reinforcer. We could use access to sex to get him to play the piano, to play tennis, to eat. All of those would be reinforcers. All of those would be activities that we could reinforce by giving him access to sex. We could not use access to food to reinforce him for doing sex, but we could use access to food to get him to play the piano or practice tennis, or practice the piano and play tennis, whichever. Okay? So anything higher on the list can be used to reward anything lower on the list. Your parents used to do that to you. They set up the ultimate contingency contract. If you keep your room clean, I will give you an allowance. That's the ultimate contingency. If A, then B. A is lower on the list, B is higher on the list. And because they control the money, they control your behavior. The boss is the same way. If you do a good job, then we'll pay you. And so in that case, the pay is higher than doing the work, but that's the reason we all work, because the pay is one of the ultimate reinforcers. Obviously, the joy that we get out of it is another reinforcer. I mean, the very idea that you're here getting educated today rather than being at home engaging in sex or sleeping or eating or shopping is clearly indicating that the role of reinforcement is involved in something behavioral, not necessarily the reduction of a drive. Okay? So the point is that the Premack principle is basically that anything higher on the list can be used to access anything lower on the list. Another example, you remember the other day, or in a previous lecture, I had my cat here, and he was in a cage. If you remember, when we put that cage up in fact, I guess he was wandering around the studio, but when I do that demonstration over in class, that cat is very leisurely about coming out of the cage, okay? Because he knows there he has a choice between coming out of the cage or falling upside down toward the floor for purposes of the demonstration. But at home, I have to get him before I get the cage, because if I get the cage out and he sees it, he's gone. I'm not going to see him until I leave for school. And several times when I've wanted to do that demonstration, I made the mistake of getting the cage out to carry him in before catching him. I don't do that anymore. I now catch him and then go get the cage. And so for him, it's very clear that the hierarchy is, number one is at home raising hell or doing whatever. Number two is being in the cage. And a distant third is falling upside down toward the floor. And the cage then becomes a swing vote. At home, he wants nothing to do with it. Here at school, on stage, in a lecture, the cage looks pretty good. And then he's much more willing to tolerate it. Enough on that. Let's raise some other issues. Is reinforcement necessary? I'm going to argue, again from this data that we looked at before, that reinforcement is sufficient to cause learning to occur, but it is not necessary. Okay? Witness, you're here today. Now, granted, I'm a dynamic lecturer. It's supposed to be, yeah, at this point. But I'm not, right, now they say it. Those are the B students. I am not naive enough to believe that. The ultimate reinforcer for you to be here today at this point would be very difficult to lay out. And the point that I would make is that there are many things that may be causing you to be here, and learning is occurring because you're here. But defining a specific reinforcer for why you're here would be very difficult to do. Okay? I'm going to argue that reinforcement is sufficient to cause learning to occur, but just like the group that had no food for the first 10 trials and then food from trial 11 onward, learning occurs even in the absence of reinforcement. So it is not necessary for reinforcement to occur. Learning will occur without reinforcement being present. A little bit later, in another couple of programs, we'll look at observational learning. That's also learning that occurs without any obvious reinforcer, as we'll see. Now, there's another question involved, and that is, what is learned? In essence, what I want to talk about is the possibility of forming what is called a stimulus-stimulus association. For instance, what I'm going to do is to show you and ask you to imagine an apple. I'm holding an apple, all right? I want you to think of an apple. I want you to form an image of an apple. Has one of those stupid markers. Of all the things that American technology has invented, I think that marker is about the stupidest. Think of the hours that are wasted by American people taking those little stickers off. I hate those things. In any case, think of an apple, okay? We've got an apple here. Now, I want you to think of an orange, okay? A nice, delicious, navel, ready-to-eat orange, okay? So what you've done is to form an image of an apple, and you've also formed an image of an orange. Now what I'm going to ask you to do is to put the two of them together, okay? We've got an image of an apple, we've got an image of an orange. When you think of apple, you now think of orange, because we've formed what could be called an SS, or stimulus-stimulus linkage, okay, in your mind. We have formed a stimulus-stimulus linkage. Now, I have a homework assignment to give you, and I have been uniformly disappointed in students' abilities to do this. But I'm going to try anyway, based on your test performance on the first exam. Your homework assignment, should you choose to accept it, in this class is, if I show you an apple, you are not to think of an orange. If I show you an orange, you are not to think of an apple. Apple and orange, in your mind, are not to be associated. I show you an apple, do not think of an orange. I show you an orange, do not think of an apple. Orange and apple, apple and orange are to be unlinked in your mind. If I show you one, I do not want you to think of the other. Okay? Apple and orange are not to be associated in your mind. Can you understand why I've been uniformly disappointed in people's ability to do that assignment? Because I have just spent an incredible amount of time forming a very vivid apple-orange link in your mind. And even the idea of suggesting the next time I show you an apple, you are not to think of an orange is ludicrous in the consideration. I have formed in your mind an SS linkage that you are powerless to break. And try as you will, you won't be able to unhinge it. The next time I show you an apple, and I will, you are going to think of an orange. And we'll have some fun in class, because whoever sticks, I will then ask, when I showed you the apple, did you think of the orange? Somebody's going to put their hand up. I didn't. They're not in class today. So we'll harass them a little bit, all right? Apple and, in fact, I'll leave them out there so you can think about them later today, okay? Apple and orange are not to be linked in your mind. That's your homework assignment, and I'll bet you don't do it. Okay. That's an SS association that we've just formed. The other possibility is to form instead what is called an SR, or stimulus response association. Example, when you've got the sound of the wind in your ears, the air is blowing through your hair, you've got the steering wheel in your hand, the gear shift lever in the other hand, your foot on the throttle, and the dotted line to the left of you, in front of you, which side of that line do you stay, left or right? To the right, of course, because we're in the United States. What if you're in Great Britain? Yeah, good luck. Now you're supposed to stay to the left of the line. That is an example of the worst possible learning situation that you and I face. It represents what is called a negative transfer situation. It is among the toughest learning situations that you and I face. If you have a stimulus situation that elicits a given response, if later on that same stimulus is now supposed to elicit a different response, that is the toughest learning situation that you and I face. If you've had the misfortune of having a boyfriend or girlfriend break up the relationship that you have, that is very difficult on the person left. Because in essence, the stimulus which traditionally elicited approach and very positive things now is supposed to cause you, in their mind, to stay away, okay, as they are from you. That is a very difficult learning situation that you and I face. When I finished my PhD, My wife and I, then wife and I, took a trip to Europe to celebrate for 5 or 6 weeks before starting life in the real world. We flew all night to get to London. And of course, you get there at 8 or 9 in the morning, and it's stupid to go to bed at that time because then you wake up at 8 at night ready to go for 16 hours, and it's dark. So we just kept pushing. We decided we'll just stretch the deadline and fix it all the first day. So we just went out and sight saw the entire first day. End of the day, we've just been viewing a beautiful castle. We've rented a car. I'm driving out of the castle on a beautiful elm-lined, straight as an arrow driveway, just magnificent, 200-year-old trees. Beautiful. I'm driving down the highway headed back to my motel so I can sleep. And here is some idiot coming toward me on my side of the road. And I kept calling him an idiot and thinking, why is this happening? He's not passing anybody. And then I realized it was me who was the idiot because I was driving on the right side. I was supposed to, of course, be on the left side of the road. So we had an accident. I was killed. It was quite tragic. But that's another example of that negative transfer. But in the broader context, what we've got is a stimulus-response linkage there. The stimulus road, for us, means the response should be stay to the right. Okay? That's an example of an SR, or stimulus-response linkage. Now, which is it? I've given you 2 different examples there. Is it, in fact, a stimulus-stimulus linkage, or is it a stimulus-response linkage? Well, psychologists retreated to the T maze and tried the following. In this particular maze situation there, what they did was to train a rat to turn to gray. I should have put a Q in the alley there, but there was a hint at the T always as to which way to turn, and the food was consistently related to stripes or polka dots, or there was some cue which randomly was assigned left or right, but it always was related specifically to where the food was. So a rat was trained to run that alley and perform correctly. In other words, the error rate had essentially dropped to 0, performance time was fast, and it was very accurate. And then what they did was to fill the maze with water. And this is a theoretical conundrum. Okay? What is the rat going to do? The SR people are forced to predict in this situation that there will be a drop in performance. Because what's happened here is, if you're taking the traditional stimulus response, or SR perspective, the stimulus alley has been linked to a series of walking responses and turns, okay, which are mechanically achieved, either left or right. But if the maze is now water-filled, you cannot use that response. In other words, you have to learn a new response. You now have to rat paddle, actually. You have to swim. That is a very different motor response than is the walking. So the SR folks are forced to predict that there's going to be a downturn in performance. The SS folks, on the other hand, the stimulus advocates, are basically arguing that what a rat learns in mastering a maze is a cognitive map. That is, he learns, and it is usually male rats that are used, so I'm not being sexist here, he learns that in fact the food is always where the stripes are, or whatever the cue is. And he's learning essentially, I'm in start box, door is removed, I go to the stripes and the food will be there. Okay? That is not hindered by whether you're walking or swimming. In other words, if conceptually you're just thinking I need to get to the stripes, get to the food, doesn't matter whether you're swimming, backstroking, walking, crawling, hands and knees, doesn't matter. So the point is, imagine the surprise when it turned out, lo and behold, performance, there was a little bit of surprise that his performance dropped for a trial or 2, but very quickly it was right back up to 100% again. That was among the earliest studies done by Tolman many years ago, probably over half a century ago now, that predicted the development of cognitive psychology. And that is essentially what happened in this situation. Now, pardon me for a second while we come back to me, so that we can switch out to the next segment of material. Give me just a second here for a quick switch of, I need to learn enough PowerPoint so that I can do this more subtly than I currently do. That's clear. Pardon me for just a second. Entertain yourself for a couple of minutes. Now I think we're ready to go. In fact, we are now probably not in the right. Aren't we slick on this television, I tell you? We are ready to go here. Okay, we're going to do slideshow, and it looks like that. And now, in fact, we're going to go into one of several types of learning that we're going to discuss today. First of all, First of all, do you remember your reaction many years ago when you were in elementary school and lightning or thunder, you heard thunder? Didn't realize at the time, of course, the danger was long since past, and you dove under the bed. Well, in essence, what's happening there is what is called classical conditioning. The first person to study this was Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov actually won the Nobel Prize early in the 20th century, early 1900s, for his studies of digestion. And that was why he was actually studying dogs and how they salivate. He was studying digestion. He was studying the role of saliva in the process of digestion. One of the observations that he made led to what is called serendipity. That is an accidental discovery. He noticed, isn't it curious, the dogs always salivate when I come into the room. Because, of course, what happened was that as part of his research, when he arrived, what he was doing was feeding the dogs. And so they very quickly came to associate him with the food. That was what he followed up on, and this is the research for which he is, in fact, best remembered, is his study of classical conditioning. So it was Ivan Pavlov who originally developed the underlying principles of what we now call classical conditioning. The original apparatus which is attributed to him is as we see diagrammed here. And in essence, the idea is that the dogs are held by a series of leather straps that are not terribly restrictive. That is, the goal is basically just to keep them oriented forward, but they can sit and scratch and sniff and do some other things, but generally they face forward. They have in front of them a screen on which visual stimuli can be presented, and there are a variety of auditory stimuli behind the screen. So there was a wide variety of stimuli or cues that could be presented. There's a food dish into which powder or food can be introduced very rapidly. Normally it was blown into the dog's mouth, typically. There is also a duct, a tube, which is connected to the salivary duct of the dog, so that when the dog salivates, what happens is the saliva goes out into this tube. It is then dropped down into some mechanics which eventually cause a needle to move on what is called a kymograph. A kymograph is exactly the same kind of apparatus as is normally used to measure earthquakes. Okay, so it's a very sensitive read, in this case on the number of drops of saliva that was emitted. Interestingly enough, it turns out this is not the apparatus that was originally utilized by Pavlov, because subsequent researchers went back and looked, and although this was widely attributed to Pavlov, somebody was able to find an early photograph of this from the Russian labs, and it turns out it was developed by a student of Pavlov, not by Pavlov himself. Pavlov himself actually used just a salivary collection tube, which in fact was surgically attached to the dog, but the tube simply connected from the salivary gland right out to the measuring tube itself. So the dog, when it was being studied, instead of having a cork in the tube, had the tube connected to a drip tube, where the researcher could literally read the number of drops that were accumulating. And that's the way the research was originally conducted. Now, to do this, we're going to start by defining 4 terms for you. The first of these, then, is what's called the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is basically any form of energy that elicits a regular, predictable, measurable response. Okay? If I clap my hands and you're not paying attention, or anybody in the room claps their hand, you're very likely to orient. It surprises you a little bit. Maybe your eyes will open wider, which is reflexive, but you will orient. The clap is an unconditioned stimulus. Okay? If I give you food when you're hungry, you will salivate. So the food is an unconditioned stimulus. Okay? We're going to put the unconditioned stimulus here on our diagram, which we're going to develop, and food is one of the best examples of an unconditioned stimulus. All right? Secondly, we need to also worry about what is called an unconditioned response. An unconditioned response is basically the regular, predictable, reliable reaction, the measurable reaction that is elicited by an unconditioned stimulus. We normally think of these as being reflexive. The tap of the doctor's hammer on your knee and the kick that you give, the hammer is an unconditioned stimulus, the kick is an unconditioned response, but we can learn them. That is, we don't have to have an automatic connection, and that is a mistake that also is alive in the literature. An unconditioned stimulus only has to be producing regular, predictable, reliable reactions. It doesn't automatically have to be automatic, okay? But an unconditioned response is regular, predictable, and measurable reaction, okay? So we're going to call that a UR. We're going to abbreviate it a UR and put it there on our diagram. And one example of a UR would be things like salivation to food, okay? So we've got an unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. All of classical conditioning is built on this linkage, the fact that an unconditioned stimulus will elicit an unconditioned response. It's that link that this is built on, okay? Now, next we're going to look at a conditioned stimulus. That's any neutral form of energy regularly preceding the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. Okay? The key word there is neutral. We can use essentially anything, but it cannot elicit any element of the unconditioned response prior to conditioning. So if we're going to do something that involves presenting food and measuring salivation, we cannot use anything that would normally elicit salivation anyway. If you're going to measure the presentation of cheese, you cannot mark the presentation of cheese by initially presenting a piece of meat, okay? Because the dog is going to salivate to that regardless of whether the cheese is there. So the key word in that definition is neutral. And by neutral, what we mean is prior to conditioning, the conditioned stimulus itself cannot elicit any element of the unconditioned response. But that leaves an amazing array of things that'll work, all right? So in essence, we call that the conditioned stimulus. We're going to leave it here on our diagram. And one example of that Pavlov used was a tone. He would sound a tuning fork or a chime of some sort, and then shortly thereafter he would feed the dog and measure the salivation. What he was actually attempting to create is what we're going to call a conditioned response. Excuse me. A conditioned response is basically the reaction that is elicited by a stimulus which is originally incapable of eliciting it. And by originally, what I mean is prior to conditioning, prior to the experimental procedure, it is unable to elicit the reaction. So we label that as a CR. And in fact, we're going to put it down in the bottom left on our diagram. Okay? So an example of the conditioned response before training is hard to specify. We don't know what it may be. Okay? So this is the setup when we start training. On this diagram, time proceeds from left to right. Okay? Left to right on all of the diagrams I'm going to be showing you here. So this is the situation before training. We've got a tone which is not linked to the unconditioned stimulus, and we've got a conditioned response which is produced, which is very tentative and does not bear any obvious relationship to the unconditioned response. This is the condition at the start of training. During training, having started with this, what begins to develop is that a link begins to form between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. And the net result is that the unconditioned response, elements of it start being emitted earlier and earlier in time. Now, one of the reasons that happens is because the tone itself in this diagram, the conditioned stimulus, is a perfect anticipatory signal. It tells you beforehand that food is about to arrive. And as you begin to make that association, what happens is that if we're measuring drops of saliva, it will begin to occur earlier and earlier and earlier in time. So that during the experiment, the salivation begins to be associated with the tone rather than the food. So that after training is completed, what we now find is, and again remember, time goes from left to right on this diagram. Once we present the tone, what happens is that the salivation occurs prior to the arrival of the food. In this diagram, in this experiment, any salivation that occurs prior to the arrival of the unconditioned stimulus counts as a conditioned response. I have a homework assignment that you are to do between now and the next lecture. Okay? When you're sitting coiled up with your significant other sometime this evening, I want you to lean over and go right into their eye. Okay? What's going to happen? Yeah, they're going to slug you, right. This will be a good test of the quality of the relationship, obviously. But 2 or 3 minutes later, again, and I want you to do that 3 or 4 times, and then the next time what I want you to do is, and what's going to happen? They will blink. Now, you're going to have some smarty that is going to go, you're not going to condition me. But if when you go, they are conditioned. Okay? Don't tell them that beforehand, but they are conditioned. Because the point is that the air puff that used to cause them to turn away or blink or in some way avoid it now is causing them instead, when you warn them that you're about to air puff, they're still reacting. So it is a conditioned response. Ultimately then, the conditioned stimulus is the air puff. The conditioned response is the anticipatory blink. Any blink that is initiated before the unconditioned stimulus arrives counts and qualifies as a conditioned response. Anything up until the air puff actually reaches the eye qualifies as an unconditioned stimulus. All right? Question for you. What are we using here? A negative reinforcer, a positive reinforcer, or a punisher? Very good. It is a negative reinforcer. Yes. And what the negative reinforcer is that the annoyance to the eye is cut off when they blink. So in fact, they are reinforcing themselves. They provide their own reinforcement very predictably. As soon as they sense the air, they blink. And they thereby terminate that minor annoyance, and they have essentially reinforced themselves. This turns out to be an extraordinarily stable form of conditioning. Very stable. I conditioned my ex-wife many years ago. This was not the reason we divorced. There were a whole bunch of other issues. But she came into the room one time early on when I was lecturing in graduate school, and I just motioned her in, and we did the conditioning right there. I just said, just stand right here and look at the class for a minute. And then I went into her eyes about 3 or 4 times and then tested, and sure enough, she blinked. And we had a wonderful bonding experience. About 10 years later, she walked by the classroom one day just at this point in the lecture, just as it happened. And I motioned her in, brought her up to the front of the class without any word at all as to what I'd been talking about or what I was going to do, and I went, and she blinked. Okay, it had been at least 5 or 6 years since we had actually tried that demonstration, but it is a very stable form of conditioning. Remember that when we get into looking at various forms of anxieties and phobias, because those turn out to be negatively reinforced, and you'll see they are very difficult to solve in a therapeutic situation. Now let's plunge on ahead here and look at another diagram. This one is a little harder to see because of the blue background there, but in essence what I'm showing you in essence is where the CS occurs. That's the left-hand vertical, what is that, maroon pinkish line. The CS comes on a little bit later, as indicated by the second shorter maroon line, and what's plotted on the 3rd and 4th lines is basically the number of drops of saliva. And although you see a little bit of saliva occurring early on in training, when the stimulus is first paired, when the CS is first paired with the unconditioned stimulus, but later on you see what happens after a number of trials, and that is that the drops of saliva now are occurring quite rapidly prior to the actual arrival of the unconditioned stimulus. Okay? Now, in terms of the various types of conditioning that can occur, timing is quite important here. If we have the unconditioned stimulus occurring at this time in the situation, delayed forward conditioning occurs if the conditioned stimulus comes on and stays on until the unconditioned stimulus arrives. Okay, that's like the tone comes on and stays on until the food arrives. All right. Secondly, we have what is called trace forward conditioning. Now what's happening is we sound the tone and it goes off, and then half a second later or so the food arrives. Now if any training occurs, it's because of its training to the memory trace. All right? And then we have what is called trace forward conditioning. Third possibility is to have the CS and the US occur simultaneously. That's what's called simultaneous conditioning. It basically does not work. And the reason is the CS has no signal value. It's not telling you anything, because by that time you've got the food powder or the food and you can react directly to that. And finally, backward conditioning is where the unconditioned stimulus occurs before the conditioned stimulus. There's no evidence at all in the literature that that works. It simply doesn't. Now, we can measure classical conditioning in terms of the magnitude of response. The number of CS-US pairings and the amount of saliva that we get goes steadily upward. That's one measure we can use. We can also measure the probability of getting, for instance, an eye blink or saliva occurring. That also goes up. More training trials, greater likelihood of saliva occurring. Third thing we can do is measure the latency or the time length between the presentation of the CS and the occurrence of the conditioned response, or CR. That will decline. That is, the latency will get shorter and shorter with training. And finally, we can train resistance to extinction. Basically what I'm suggesting is that if we present the CS alone If you just keep puffing in your boyfriend or girlfriend's eyes, they will gradually stop conditioning, stop blinking. That's what's called resistance to extinction. The stronger the conditioning, the longer it takes to extinguish them.